Allen, President Hudson, Councilor Bay, Councilor Thompson, Councilor Green, and we are on page 116, I believe it starts. So, 116, the budget book. So I'm going to start with this. It may be not as interesting answers for IT, but what was your biggest accomplishment from the current fiscal year date, and what's your biggest goal for the upcoming budget year?
Good morning, councilors. Our biggest accomplishment, I guess, is putting together the assessment roll. It's an annual function that we do. It's required by law. Almost everything we do is in some way or another dictated by the real property tax law. Each year, we compile the assessments of the almost 42,000 parcels in the city of Syracuse. We place a number for land and total assessment on every property. We also administer all the exemptions from property taxes, not-for-profit exemptions, aged exemptions, veterans exemptions. There's literally hundreds of different types of exemptions. And that's how we come up with the total taxable assessment for the city of Syracuse each year.
So is your accomplishment for the current year is sort of like your goal for the next year then?
The goal is the same every year. It's basically try to assess properties in the city equitably so that we're spreading the tax burden fairly based on the real property tax law.
Are there any changes that you would like to do or have done or doing that make it so you're able to continue to do what you do with less, so to speak, or more efficiently?
Well, I mean, it would be easier if we were at 100% of value, if we did a reval. Unfortunately, revals cost money. Around $2 million to do a reval here in the city of Syracuse. I mean, that would make it easier to explain to people because right now the equalization rate is dropping to 78%. So we have to explain to people that, you're assessed at 78% of what we're saying the value of your property is. So it just makes it a little bit more difficult to explain.
If you did a revalue, it would be 100%?
Yes, that's the goal of a reval. Yeah, we would go to 100%. That's what we did the last time we did a revaluation in '92, I think it was.
Okay, I have just a couple of questions that are not related explicitly to your budget, but to assessment in general.
Okay.
So the property tax assessed value in the city of Syracuse went up?
Yes, about 0.7%, I think.
0.7%. So how, I do believe the mayor described that as a 60% increase in growth from the last year. So that 0.7% when it was really small the year before is a really big percent change that makes a funny talking point. But 0.7% went up. How, in the last 10 years, has it typically gone up?
We've had increasing taxable assessment for the last few years. Just most of that, I believe, is due to pilots running out, Empire Zone exemptions phasing out, and some of the new construction that's happened here in the city.
So in your experience as the assessor, when a property gets an exemption, does the value of the property kind of go up from owner's perspectives if you're not paying taxes? Or if you're paying less taxes, like a pilot?
I'm not sure that the value of the property goes up. It could be used as a marketing tool. If there's for example, an existing pilot on a property and there's, say, 8 years left to go on the pilot, that might be an attractive marketing tool. Same thing with an exemption.
If a tax break, a pilot was taken away for some reason, like for instance, we had the 485A discussion where, maybe there's not compliance, what would happen if we revoked it? If we revoked it, would that make the property value less to that owner?
If you looked at a property just from an income standpoint, it would obviously affect the cash flow. So I imagine it would affect the value.
Dollars, yeah, it would, I think.
But not necessarily you'd have to test it against the market to see how the market reacts to that change.
Isn't the market based on income, based on the money flowing from the
That's
property?
one approach to
That's one
determining
approach.
market value, yeah.
Okay. A property tax increase, a property rate increase, do you think it threatens growth in the assessed value of the community at large? So does raising the rate make it so properties overall are less valuable, in your opinion?
Small increases in the tax rate, I don't think have any effect on property value.
Okay. I watched last year's, we didn't have a ton of stuff, but you had a really, I have a curse word down, but a really cool beard last year at this time.
I did. Yes, I did. I'll admit to that.
And I had done like a bootleg shaving job, so I'm gonna try to be more like you this budget season.
Okay, fair enough.
Other
Yep.
questions?
So there's been in the news talk about the star exemption going back to the state.
Yes.
And I'm curious how that would impact your department, like what percentage of your workload is associated with processing those currently?
A large percentage, actually. Ann could probably speak to that better than I could, but our office administers all exemptions. The most numerous exemption, if you will, is the star exemption. Anybody who owns and lives in their house could apply for the star exemption. Nowadays, though, ever since I think 2016, New York State has been requiring that property owners apply to New York State for that exemption. So instead of receiving, what is it, $410 or so off of your city school bill, you get a check from New York State for that amount, the same amount that people save in their star exemption. Anybody who has had the star exemption since prior to 2016 gets to keep it at this point in time. I believe it's one of the governor's initiatives to switch that all over to New York State administering. The good thing about the star exemption from our point of view, there's a couple things. One, New York State pays us back for it, so it doesn't cost the city anything, except for our time administering it. Once you have it in place, it stays there until you no longer own the property or don't live on the property. So that's pretty much it for the star exemption.
My question is it's aligned with Councilor Green. On here, this is the first time you guys have to administer the flood zone exemptions.
Yes.
So, aligned with his question, how is that impacting your workflow or impacting the assessment office?
We process those exemptions the same way we process other exemptions that have certain qualifications, things like looking at people's income tax statement. In this particular exemption, we have to look to make sure that they actually have flood insurance that covers the year that the exemption would in place. So
And so you're only expecting 100 of these
Yes.
for the year?
yes, that's our estimate. We got about 50 in that were qualified. Is that right? And so we imagine that we're going to get another 50 in this year, hopefully.
And cost-wise though, does it decrease the amount of money that they would have normally paid into assessments? Is the decrease dramatic?
It decreases their taxes. What it does is it exempts a portion of their assessment up to, I think it's 86 and some change, so that the maximum exemption they could get off of their city bill would be around $750, assuming they had a property that was worth.
But since it's you only have 50, then you're not going to see like a huge drop, or will you, financially?
No, the number of these is so small, it's not going to affect the taxable value that much.
Okay.
If you were talking about something like, I don't know, not-for-profit exemptions,
And while
there's a
you're on
lot
that
of
one,
those.
yeah, while we're on the exemptions, what does that not-for-profit exemptions, are you seeing an increase in that?
Yes, we have been seeing increases in the number of non-for-profit exemptions.
Is it the churches? Is it,
It's a combination, there's a lot of not-for-profits being formed. Some of them actually are formed to own property.
Right.
I have a problem with giving a not-for-profit exemption to somebody who's doing the same thing as somebody who's paying their taxes right next door.
I agree.
If they're renting out a building for profit, I don't care if they call themselves a not-for-profit, I don't want to
Do
give
you
them an
have a
exemption.
list of those folks that we could kind of share, look at?
I don't, not offhand. I mean, we're being sued by one property owner that owns 3 properties or 4 properties, 4 one-family houses. They rent out to people that are Section 8 tenants, and they want to be exempt because they're a not-for-profit.
We need to know this stuff.
Well, you know, it's going to go through the courts, and I think the courts are probably going to decide whether they're eligible for the not-for-profit exemption. The courts have been expanding what, at least downstate especially, what not-for-profits, you know, are what they're allowed to do with property taxes. And I mean, they can own property and just get an exemption because they own it. And there should be qualifications. In our legislative package, we've asked New York State to tighten up the not-for-profit law to define, hey, if somebody's renting out a corner of their building, that part of the building at least should be
Well, you need to let us help you.
taxable. As a matter of fact,
State.
the whole property should be taxable as far as I'm concerned. Because
Okay.
that's not a not-for-profit function, making money off of your real estate.
Absolutely. One more quickie and then I'm done. Other exemptions, what is other exemptions?
There are, like I say, there are hundreds of exemptions. You know, a bunch of them are listed here, but, you know, for example, there's like 5 kinds of veterans exemptions. There's exemptions for if somebody improves their property. If you put money into your house, say you build a garage, and it causes an increase in assessment, you can apply for an exemption in our office, a 5-year exemption, and it phases in that increase over 5 years. So in the first year, when you expended the money, you invested the money in your property, you know, you don't get hit with a tax increase, at least on your city school bill. That's one of the exemptions. We have an exemption for vacant properties. We have an exemption for brand-new houses.
For vacant property?
They have to be an unoccupied hazard. They have to be boarded up and need tons of work. And a lot of people avail themselves of these exemptions. These are available just in the city of Syracuse. We're the only people that have them.
And can I get a list of all the exemptions at some point?
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
Counselor Thompson?
Yes, Commissioner, can I ask you to look at page 361?
360, I don't have,
We don't have a book.
I have 116 through 121.
They ought to have a book, just a book that anybody who comes up can use.
Thank you. Okay, yes. This is the exemption impact report, yes.
Can you explain that, please?
Sure. This lists, actually, almost all the exemptions that we have here in the city of Syracuse, so this might be your answer. It tells you how many we have here in Syracuse.
This tells you the category and the number, right? I think
tells-
she may be asking even more specifically.
It tells you the amount, the equalized value, which isn't very helpful, and then the percent of the total assessed value that is exempted by each of those exemptions.
What's the number of exemptions? 1,040 in the middle. System code 25,900. What's that? That's a lot of. I mean, it's not a huge value, but it's a lot of exceptions.
I'm not sure. I'd have to actually look that up. These are New York State codes, these exemption codes. 25,900.
That's the land bank.
Oh, that's the
Okay.
land bank.
Yep, so that's the land bank. Yep, okay.
How do they have 1,000? We ever hear 1,000 in terms of land bank? Isn't it like 750? They got 1,000. Yeah.
That's how many properties are exempted with the land bank code. In other words, how many properties they owned as of the first of the year.
I just wanted to bring that to the council's attention, so
Thank
that's
you.
why I asked.
Can I ask one more quick question? Is there a way that you could give us a list? I see you have 269 religious. Do you have all 269 of them listed? Can we do that
Yes.
too? Thank you. Let me see. Too little.
Are there thresholds? Like, there's only a few, but they say not-for-profit housing. There's a couple categories along those lines.
Yes, those
So
are,
what,
those are generally shelter rent agreements. We have, that's the only exemption that we have to go to council to ask permission to grant. Shelter rent exemption.
budget book is hitting the mic? Thanks.
It's on the table.
Or your wrist or something. Anyways, stop, thank you. Sorry, shelter rent agreement,
Shelter rent agreements, those are for affordable housing. When an affordable housing project like Salina Crossing or Butternut Crossing or even Clinton Plaza, those are under shelter rent agreements. They usually they pay payments in lieu of taxes that are based upon a formula, which is the difference between the gross rent minus the utilities, and then 10% of that amount. So they pay that rather than paying based on the assessed value of the property. This exemption is out there to encourage development of affordable housing. And we have a number of those here in the city of Syracuse.
I have a quick question. Mixed-use properties outside New York City.
Yeah, that's the 485A exemption. That exemption is not available in New York City.
That's the one with the machine. That's a business.
That one is over, 'cause this is the money amount, right?
Right.
The city.
That's how much is exempted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what,
Syracuse
would
has
that-
more of the 485A exemptions than any other city.
Okay, that's a lot.
Yes, it is. Well,
Over $2 million.
yep.
Commissioner, the vacant property exemption, that's a local
Yes,
initiative?
yes, it is.
And how do you become what's the eligibility for that? What do you need to?
Well, like I said, we have two different ones that are local. One is the 485O. That's for vacant properties that are unoccupied hazards. They've been sitting there for over a year, boarded up, and they're considered to be a hazard. They have to qualify and get certified by our office and by codes before they can get this exemption. And then if somebody fixes that up, that house, they get a 10-year exemption.
So, but do they get an exemption while it's hazardous?
Well, no, theoretically, the assessment would be reduced on a house that's boarded up and needs lots of work. So, we would go out. Yeah, it doesn't always happen because we're not always made aware that a property has deteriorated physically.
never really made aware, right?
No, sometimes, I mean, just observation is we're going through each block in the city, doing if we're looking at a house here,
But you're going
and you look
through
on the other side of the street and you see, hey, wait a minute, that house is boarded up, then we will list that and go back and look at it later to see if it's still in poor condition and reassess it based on its current condition.
Well, so that makes sense that it would be worth less, obviously, if it's unoccupied. But is there a specific exemption that we have that you're able to apply for if it's vacant?
If you fix it up, the exemption applies to the increase due to the
If you
renovation.
improve it. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's like a first step in a process to improve it. Is that what the intent is?
The intent is to help people, encourage people to invest in these properties rather than leave
So you're
them.
flagging it as saying, look, it's vacant, we're giving you the exemption, we're giving this status, which means if you do buy it and fix it, it's a signal to investors that you're eligible for this.
Yeah, investors have to come to us to apply for the exemption. We can't go out and just, talk to investors and say, hey, we've made it, it's on our website. We sent, I think there's, the forms are in codes. We try to advertise it, but.
So we're incentivizing making houses not vacant.
Correct.
Not the opposite, okay, so. I
Correct.
understand.
Yeah, it's not an exemption for being vacant, yeah.
You said there were two.
Yeah, I mean, there's two halves to the 485-0. That, one is for unoccupied hazards, the other is for brand-new construction of a one or two family house, I think. So if somebody were to build a house in the city of Syracuse, they can apply for a 10-year exemption on that. If they get LEED certified, that time can be extended. So, and then there is the 485J, the 5-year exemption, and that's for any improvement to a residential property that causes an increase in assessment. Any physical improvement that causes an increase in assessment. So if you do something to your house and as a result of you doing that, your assessment goes up, the 485J is available to.
And we don't know that a lot of times, right? Because a lot of folks do things to their house and you're not aware of it.
A lot of people, believe it or not, don't take out permits.
Right, that's my point.
So when that happens, sometimes we're not aware of improvements. Sometimes,
Do what they're supposed to do?
a lot of people do.
Syracuse?
I think most people do.
No. Councilor Bay had a question.
This is just relative to 45. Is there any way to demonstrate for the council, maybe not asking for that this second, but maybe over the last 10 years of revenue collected on properties that had 45 versus exemption?
You mean how much they saved?
How much they save versus how much you collect on the parcel?
Well, once again, there's a number of different 485 exemptions. 485A is the big one. That's the 12-year exemption. It's the most generous one. So in that exemption, for the first 8 years, they don't pay on the increase in assessment due to the conversion from commercial to mixed use. They just don't pay on that increase. And then it phases in that increase 20% a year until it's fully taxable in the 13th year. So it's a very powerful exemption. As a result of that exemption, properties like the Pike Block, the State Tower Building, Merchants Commons, they've all taken advantage of that exemption.
Right, because it's a by right exemption, and
It's not quite by right. They still have to meet the qualifications in the property tax law. They have to spend a certain amount, they have to apply within a certain amount of time. There's been properties that have missed out on the exemption because they waited too long to apply.
Right.
And we can't help them.
but there's no way to demonstrate revenue after the fact, like revenue generated by the city on those parcels, for example, versus the money they save, versus the exemption.
I mean, I suppose we could try to look at how much they'd saved and how much they paid through
Right.
for the last 10 years, you're saying?
Yeah,
It's a lot of properties, but we could look at them.
yeah, I know.
We could try to, okay. Just the 485A.
Just 45.
Just two quick things. On the Board of Assessment Review, we pay $100 a day. 15 years ago, after I graduated college, I worked as a substitute teacher and I got paid $150 a day. So do you find that a hindrance to getting people, and doesn't seem like the biggest expense? Should we pay more? Is it an obstacle? $100 a day works for the people who do it?
I guess that's a personal choice. I don't know.
Why do people do it? I mean, they're skilled people, right? It's not like a unskilled task. They're doing it for $100 a day.
Community service?
So people with real estate experience.
It's not a
they're gonna
whole
set
day.
Assessed values.
It's usually only a few hours
You
a
pay
day.
$100 a day.
Yeah, it's
It seems-
usually only a few hours a day. And these are very civic-minded people that you know, care about the city of Syracuse. So they're willing to spend their time
Okay.
in the
fabulous.
mornings.
And then 3% of your budget is 14K. If you had to take it from somewhere, what would you do? I could see where I would take it from, but
We're pretty close to the bone right now. When I started in the assessment department, we had 23 people. Right now, with this budget, we've got about 10.
yeah, I wouldn't take it from there. I mean, you do have the professional service line, which we talked about last year, which I know you used to RFP for all the
For the-
appraisals. I
Yes,
think.
yes.
And that line,
And
the
that-
actual was 10.5. The adopted was
Yeah.
45. I know the adopted was like 40. It's been 45, I think, every year. And this year, the projected is 23. I assume you're just asking for flexibility in case you had a big one.
Yeah, it-
But why couldn't you just lower it and then ask for more if something went horribly wrong?
We may have to do that if we, you know, if we have to trim the budget even further.
go.
That's probably.
Looks like a good line to me.
One quick.
The problem with that is, if some of the cases that are right now before the court, like the developmental center, Sam's Club,
You could always come back to the council.
these things would require expensive appraisals because they're complex properties, and it could eat that up very quickly.
It couldn't. You can come back and ask us for more. It's gonna be an exciting new year.
Mr. Clifford,
Okay,
can
yes.
you actually, do you have a list of how much we've gained from the pilot expirations? Because it shouldn't be a slew of them.
No, there's only a couple each year that usually expire, but it contributes to property going back onto the taxable portion of the roll. So, I could let you know which ones have done it for the last couple of years.
Okay, thank you.
And with that, I'll end this budget hearing. Thank you, Commissioner Clifford.
You're welcome.
Thank you,
Councilors.